Nice. What's up? All right, we're doing another drawing stream. Nothing too crazy. We're gonna start with some warm-ups and just drawing some faces, then we'll probably move on to animals like always, but here we go. We're just gonna draw a new setup too, so hopefully everything looks better. I'm still messing around with the lighting and everything, but we're chilling. To start off, warming up, we're just gonna work on another face. Nothing too crazy this time. We're still working on getting all of our proportions correct. We're still working on, laying out where we need the eyes and the nose and the mouth, but we made some really good progress the last time. Just really focusing on structure before everything and then, laying in that detail as we go, which is sick. One second, just going to check in. Nice. Okay. And we're not going from any reference or anything super specific. We're just going to be drawing a face from imagination. And to do that, what you want to do is you want to start with this sort of oval shape, like always. And we're just going to put a line right through the exact middle of that oval. So you have sort of that top half here and that top half there. And then from here, we're going to take this bottom half section and we're going to cut that in half as well. And what this does is this sets up where our eyes are going to be, relatively, and then where the bottom of the nose is going to be. So we can sort of just like mark out these general shapes. I'm going to put in sort of a triangle shape for the nose, right? And then right at sort of the bridge of the nose is where the two eyes link up. So we're just going to put in little ideas of eyes, nothing super permanent yet. We're just going to hang out and chill with that. And then you see we still have this sort of quarter section of the head, right? And what we're going to do is we're going to lay in a line that's just about half, a little bit less than half, and that's going to be our mouth line or our lip line. So this line is going to coincide pretty much with where the middle of the lips or where the two lips meet, right? The mouth, if you will. So we're just going to lay in a little bit of an indication for there. If you want, you can throw in sort of an oval of color just to sort of give us an idea of where we want these lips to be. And something to remember when you're drawing a mouth or when you're drawing any sort of lips on any sort of character, especially if you're doing it realistic, the ends of the mouth are always going to hook up with the middles of the eyes. So you can draw these two super light guidelines just straight through the middle of the eye, straight down, and you'll find about where the ends of your lips should be, right? Is that making sense? So now that we have sort of all these base shapes, again, like the best thing to do whenever you're starting a drawing is just take your time. Just take really slow attempts and draw broad shapes. Nothing too crazy. You don't want any sort of detail in this first stage, because what we're doing is we're mapping out where everything should be. And once you take a step back from that drawing, and once you take a step back and look at all of these proportions, you can sort of start talking to yourself and seeing like, okay, this eye is too big, or these eyes are too close together, or they're not far enough from the mouth, all of these things. And then once you have that general idea, you can start going in and adding little bits of detail here and there, just ideas of everything. And then you can sort of start taking that leap of faith. And for the eye, we're just going to start with that sort of top line of that almond shape that you see in every other drawing. You can see I did the same thing for all these three drawings here. And again, we're keeping all of our lines super, super light, because what I've found recently is if I save all of the detail and all of the sort of the points that make a drawing until the very end, it always turns out way better than if I just try and bum rush and get to detail immediately, right? So already as I'm starting to do this detail stage, I realized that this right eye wasn't in the exact right spot that I wanted it to, so I just erased it quick and I'm going to retry, and boom, that one looks a hell of a lot better. And that's sort of the power of taking your time with this sort of drawing method, is you can always erase. That should be the goal from day one. You should always be able to erase whatever line you're doing until the exact end of the drawing. Like that polish stage is the most important, but this structure stage is even more so, because when you're doing all of this structure, you're really actually mapping out where everything's going to be, where all the detail is going to be, all of the shading, everything like that. And that sets your drawing up for success way better than just practicing drawing so much that you can just sort of pencil to paper, get a drawing out, and make a cartoon or make a realistic drawing or whatever. This like really trains your brain to think about all of the little details that you need to make a face, and then it trains you so then you can eventually get to that point where you just get right to paper and you start drawing and you can make whatever character you want to. So I'm keeping all of my lines super light. I added a little indication of nostrils on these two sides. For the mouth, I'm going to take a leap of faith because I think I like where it is at right now. So I'm going to draw that middle line. And the fun part about when you're drawing mouths or when you're drawing faces in general, something to always remember is there are 3 spots where you're going to have like actual dark lines in a drawing, and that's the middle of the mouth, usually like the eyelids or the pupils, and then the nostrils. Everything else on a face drawing or anything else on most drawings are all just going to be different shades of gray, or if you're using colored pencils, it's going to be different shades of colored pencil. Tough unk. Thank you, Gemma. So as you're doing it, like when you are starting to lay in real detail into a drawing, you can remember, like, as you can see with all of these drawings, like the darkest spots of the drawing are the eyes, right underneath the nose, and that middle line of the mouth. Everything else is just like a different shade, right? Holy hell, 1,200 likes? Thank you so much. That's badass. I saw you kind of grinding out all those hearts. That's so funny. Thank you. But as we go, another thing to keep in mind is proportion. Like proportion is pretty much everything in drawing. If you can make a drawing proportional, then you're going to have a way better drawing than something that looks crazy and like the eyes are looking in different directions, they're super far apart, the nose is too small or too big. So another thing that we can think about while we're drawing is you can sort of measure out an entire face by the width of the eyes, right? So if you take this eye width, we know just from past drawings that the nose has to be the same width of one eye, and on the sides of eyes you usually have one extra eye width. So that sort of maps out the width of your drawing from the get-go. You can immediately see like if you have sort of all of the proportions wrong by looking at the eyes. So that's why whenever I'm drawing faces, I usually start with that big oval. I map out all of the lines, like the midline and the nose line. And then from there, I'll draw the eyes. And if the eyes are too big or too small, that's sort of when I have the inkling that I should change those, because they're going to dictate all of the proportions of the rest of the drawing. Like if, say, I have this oval and I draw one eye way too wide, I know that I have to fit 5 of those widths across, so I have to shrink that eye down so it fits within this face, right? So we have this width, and you can even check with your pencil, that's about that whole wood part, and that nose lines up perfectly. So we know that the nose can never be any wider than that sort of section that I marked off. So we can feel pretty comfortable going in and really making this nose permanent. So we're going to add in our little nostrils. And then from here too, you can add that sort of bottom edge of the nose. The nose sort of always links up and hooks up with those nostrils. So if you can at least get the idea of the nostril correct, then everything else should just flow into it and that curve should stay. So if you look at yourself in the mirror, you have sort of that dip right there, and then that tip of the nose folds into those nostrils, and then the outer part of the nostril just hooks right in. So it's sort of, as you're drawing and as you're sort of figuring out all of these proportions, it's really smart to remember that the drawing is talking to you. It's like showing you where it wants the detail, and by taking the super slow approach that I'm sort of teaching, it like it trains you to realize all of these little pitfalls that we constantly fall into and all of these things that we can super easily fix. It just takes that little extra bit of time to realize like, hey, okay, I know that the nostril is going to be really important. I know that the eye width is going to be really important. So I'm going to take a little bit of extra time, like maybe an extra minute, on all of those things to make sure they're correct. So then when I do start drawing or start adding in some real detail, I can be comfortable with every single line that I lay down. And that sounds kind of crazy, but it is really important to think about every sort of line that you're laying into a drawing, because it's like it's all detail, it's all data for you to see and for your viewers to see. And as you can see, I just put through, oh, thanks for all the likes, that's so badass. Really means a lot. As you can see, I know that the nose is going to be the highlighted part. Like when you are looking at yourself in a mirror, you can see the light always hits your nose first because it's the furthest out from your face, right? So the sun or the room light or whatever is always going to hit that first. So we can just sort of assume that this front plane or this front panel of the nose is always going to be the lightest. So to make sure that everybody knows that that's the lightest, I'm just going to lay in a little bit of shading all around the sides and then up above underneath that eyebrow bone, right? And speaking of eyebrow bones, thanks for all the likes, Charlotte. That means a ton. If you're like comfortable with drawing and if you're trying to get into faces, learning skulls is super important, because then if you know how to draw a skull, you then understand that there is like a pretty large circle and a pretty large cavity for the eyeball to fit inside of. So as you're doing this and as you're working through like placing the eyes and placing the eyebrows, you know that underneath all of the skin is a skull structure. So we know that eye cavity reaches up and around that eye. So we know that it's always going to be about this far up from the eye before the eyebrow even starts, because you can't have an eyebrow where it's going to be, like eyelid or anything like that. So by adding this shading and by adding this sort of top line, it really gives us that indication and that knowledge and detail that, we still have a bunch of eyelid to draw up here. And you can just draw like little folds, nothing too crazy. We're just like indicating that the eyelid is here. And you can even go in and, depending on the person that you're drawing, maybe their eyelids stick out a little bit too, so they're not going to be in that shadow spot, right? So you can just draw those eyelid details, and then all of a sudden you have like a way more dimensional drawing, because those eyelids are a little bit lighter than what that brow bone shadow casts, right? So now that we have that, we're just going to start laying in an idea of an eyebrow, right? Just a little bit of scraggly, like scratchy hair. Depending on who you're drawing, eyebrows always look different, but for this drawing, we're going to keep this style of sort of bushy, scratchy eyebrows. And all of a sudden, they reach out over just a little bit past into the nose area. All of a sudden, this face looks a hell of a lot more realistic, right? And we've just been slowly adding in that detail. And now we can sort of, hey, Magnus, I'm doing well, how are you doing? We're doing faces again, but we're gonna move on to raccoons and animals pretty soon. But as you can see, like, I'm taking my time with all these details, and I'm taking my time with all the shading and everything, and as you sort of lay in just a little bit by little bit, the drawing just like comes alive. Instead of like right away, I'm going to draw two eyes super dark, I'm going to draw a nose, a mouth, everything, and then figure out the head. Like when you're doing it this way, you're sort of giving yourself that opportunity to keep things proportional from the very beginning all the way until the end. And it usually ends up, or at least for me, it always ends up making the drawing a lot more successful. So we're just going to add in some pupils here, or at least irises, just to make our drawing look a little bit more alive. And we can already see, based on the eyebrows and the eyes and the nose and the mouth, this oval that we drew in the very beginning isn't exactly wide enough. I'm doing well, thanks for asking. No problem. You still been drawing, Magnus? Um, but moving forward, so we know that this oval is a little bit too small, right? So what we're going to do is we're going to stretch out just a little bit, and we're going to give new reference points for where we want that sort of temple spot to hit. And already, because we have this oval from previous and now we have these two extra lines, we can sort of tell, okay, that looks correct, that feels correct, so I'm going to run with that. This line instead of that previous oval. And we're just going to come down, super simple, because this face is looking directly at us. Yeah, I've been drawing a bit. I've been trying to make shapes in perspective and do cell shading. Oh, sick. Badass. I can do a little bit of that too if you still want to see it, but I was thinking about doing some raccoons and animals. But we can take that line straight down, and we'll have sort of an angled line, nothing too crazy yet. But once you get about to that mouth line, and you can see this in the mirror too as you look, the jawline starts at about the mouth or just underneath it. So we're just going to keep that line from the temple right down, and then once we get to about the lips, we can cut in and draw that jawline in. We're going to give this person just a slightly strong jawline, just so it reads better and it looks and it fits the description that I just gave. But you can see like the mouth is about right here, and that jawline is just under where it starts to curve in. And you can see like already when you're looking, how do you know how big to make the head around the face? You actually don't really know. That's why I always start with this big general oval, because then that's what tells me how big to make the face. And then once the face looks proportional, you can go back and you can sort of fine tune that oval that you had. Does that make sense, Charlotte? Because if you start with the head and then you mess up the proportions of the face, there's really no going back, and vice versa. So by just doing a very like easy oval or easy circle, you set up some parameters, and then you can just like slowly fine tune it, like how I did just then. Like if I could do the same exact drawing, but I could make the oval this big, and then from here I would do the same thing. I would cut it all in half, and then I would draw my eyes right here. I would know that I have to draw my nose about right there and my mouth there, and then from here, like all of those same details that I just said work because I set up that first parameter of that main circle, right? So back to this one, we can just sort of fine tune and fix all of these lines because I feel pretty comfortable with how they're looking. And then we can sort of add in, for another piece of information and detail, we can add in the ears, and ears always start at the eye line and end at the nose line. So you can just, depending on, the character that you're drawing, you can draw the ears how wide or the size that you want them, and then just throw in some of those curves of the cartilage. Thank you. No problem, Charlotte. Sick, Magnus, I can do that for you. And then basically what we have here is we're getting to those final stages where we can finally start like laying in that hard detail. We've done all setup this whole time. We've been drawing for what, like 15 minutes, and we really haven't done any sort of permanent lines yet. So we can go in and you can really start playing, and since you have all of the proportions correct, you can start adding in all of the real detail that you wanted to the whole time. And you can really start making this drawing look how you imagined it in the very beginning, right? So we'll add in those little eyelid lines, the little creases. Maybe this person has a little bit of baggage under their eyes. We can give a little bit of a stronger indication of that, the front little part of the nose. We can darken up those nostrils. You can add, this is like a perfect time to start adding like aging lines or laugh lines or all of those things. We could even throw in a little bit of a shadow underneath the nose. We can go back in and start coloring in the lips. And for the lips, what I usually like to do is I like to leave this spot of the bottom lip a little bit lighter than everything else. And then I like to draw a pretty dark shadow right underneath the lip to sort of give that dimension. And then when you go back in and you make sure that this middle line is super dark, because as I said in the beginning, there's only a few places on the face that it's really dark. Oh, hey, Mary. Thanks for sending the gift. Um, you can sort of add a little bit of a darker line right on top of that midline to give that top lip a little bit of extra depth. And then you can just slowly work your way through all of the permanent details that you want for this face, because we spent all of that time doing that setup and that structure and blueprinting. So we're just going to darken up these irises a little bit. We can pretend this character has brown eyes, big brown eyes. And then basically the rest of we have to do is just the top of the head and some hair. So what I usually like to do is, when I get bored with a drawing, I'll just kind of go crazy with some of the hair and make it very like swoopy and wavy, just because it doesn't really matter. As we're practicing and as we're doing this, my main focus is to get better at faces. And so it's always smart to have that sort of guiding goal as you're working on drawings of, am I practicing hair today, or am I just practicing the face? And then you don't have to worry so much about all of the little parts of the hair if you really only care about the face, and you don't have to worry about all of the parts of the face if you're just caring about the hair, and vice versa. So for this hair, we're just going to do something crazy like that, kind of like an Oompa Loompa. And then we can go back into this face and add some aging lines and some shadows around this hair as it's like pluming away from the head. And that's essentially it. The rest of it is just laying in some detail around the cheekbones. You can shade the bottom of the jaw depending. You can throw in a neck if you want to, but that's basically it. As long as you start with that sort of main oval and you work your way through all of the, the midline for the eye, the quarter line for the nose, and then that eighth line for the mouth, you can just slowly work your way through all of the details, laying them in super slow. And if you spend, 15 minutes on all of the setup, then the last 5 minutes of doing hard detail makes it way more fun, and your drawings always end up being a little bit more successful than they would have been previously. So, what we're going to do now is switch into drawing raccoons and other little critters and animals for fun. We might even do some cell shading and perspective drawings just as like some extra help and some extra practice, but we're rocking, dude. We're chilling. So I think for this start, we're going to rip a raccoon first. Magnus, don't worry, I'll get to your shapes. I just really want to draw this raccoon. But same thing, like how we start a phase 2 is really helpful for starting animals as well. Actually, I'm gonna switch the page just because it's hard to see through that paper. As you're drawing any sort of animal, all of those same structure points and all of those same lessons that we talked about for human faces apply to animals too. Like you can break down pretty much any complex shape or any complex person or animal or whatever. Your cousin loves raccoons. Dude, I love raccoons too. They're so fun. We had this huge fat one in our neighborhood, and it was like sitting up in this short tree, and it would hiss at people as they walked by. He was awesome. But basically all of the same shapes or like all of the same structure points can be used for pretty much any like animal or human. So what we're going to start with for this raccoon is just sort of a big oval. Usually like it's smart to know the skull structure and like the bone structure of the animal or the person that you're drawing, because then it gives you that sort of setup of, do I want the oval long this way, like vertically or horizontally? And for a lot of animals, you usually end up doing more of a horizontal head shape just because their skulls are a lot flatter than ours. They have a lot more power in their jaw instead of, like a huge brain like we have and all of those sorts of things. So for this raccoon, we're going to start with that midline for the eye. And then because raccoons have snouts like dogs or cats or any sort of animal like that, we're going to, instead of setting up sort of a triangle for the nose, we're going to set up more of a 3D object, like a prism, that's going to dictate sort of the boundaries that we have to draw this snout, right? So raccoons usually have, this cylinder type snout. Same with dogs. Like this, you can use this sort of method for, I'd say, dogs and raccoons for sure. Cats are a little bit more square in their snouts and a little bit wider. So just sort of really take into account where and what you're setting up for your drawing, and what sort of animal and what sort of snout shape it has. But for this raccoon, we can sort of set up this Pringles can of a shape, and we're just laying in all of these little boundary lines. Like, I know that it's going to connect up to the eyes about here, but usually raccoons have a little bit of a lower bridge, so I'm just going to set up all of these structure and blueprint and all of these little tiny lines. So as I'm going in and adding more and more detail, and as I'm going in and finishing this drawing, I have all of these things to lean on to understand like where I need certain details, where the eyes start, all of those good things. So with that, usually raccoons have pretty beady eyes, pretty circular, like rat-like eyes almost, and they're usually pretty close together. So we're just going to lay in an idea of the eye, and we're going to take a step back and think, are they too far apart? And my gut's telling me just a little bit. So because we're still in this sort of setup phase, we're just going to erase those eyes like nothing happened, and we're going to retry. And that's the power of, like, when you're starting slow like this, I might even move them down a little bit. When you're starting slow and just doing all of these super light lines, you have the ability to pretty much always fix and move around all these shapes without having, total failure. Like, drawing with pen or drawing really hard lines all the time, it like really does yourself a disservice, because if you mess up then, you just have to start on a new page. Could you use that prism setup for a bear's snout? Oh, definitely, Maddie. Here, I actually have, I'll show you. I did a bear drawing just recently. Where is it? Here we go. So just recently, I don't know if you're still in the chat, but the same thing happened here. So we drew this big bear head, like a big circle, and then for the neck we did sort of a rectangle shape. And then the snout, I basically drew a circle and a square right here, and then I brought those lines up to that nose or that snout, if that makes sense. But it's the same exact principle for pretty much all animals and everything of the sort. Like, if you just break things down into super simple shapes, like this heron started off as just a big triangle, and then I filled in sort of the three-dimensionality, and then its head was a big circle, and its neck was just a whole bunch of those cylinders and those prisms. But yeah, it definitely works for a bear snout, and it works for big cats usually too. Like this one, I drew a big square right here, and then I connected that square into the face to sort of set up that slope and that shape of the big cat's face. And same thing with wolves. Like, everything can be broken down into those simple shapes, and as you're working on them and as you're figuring it out, you just sort of start learning which animals need sort of what kind of simple shape to make them complete. So for this raccoon, it's a little bit more of a rounded cylinder shape, but it's still all of those same principles of, like, can I break this down into a slightly more simple shape so I can understand it and I can draw it better? And also, can I make it so I have more boundaries? Like, the more boundaries you set up for yourself, the more boxes and containers and lines and sort of proportional setups you can do for yourself, the better. Because then, like, instead of having this whole white space to draw one thing, or this whole white space to draw like a person's face, there's nothing holding me back from drawing the two eyes like way far apart here. But when you set up, you know, either a prism or a box or like an oval or any sort of shape, then it contains the drawing and it gives you those boundaries. And the more boundaries you have, the better your proportions are going to be pretty much every single time. So, moving on, I'm just sort of slowly figuring out where I want all these details of the raccoon. I'm even going to go so far as to start adding in an outline of its little robber's mask. Just because the more of these light details that I have, the more of these little setup points I have, the more I have to lean on as I'm drawing. Like if I can see that some of these, like this, the dark fur around their eyes, if I can see that those are way too big for the drawing, then I know that the snout has to change or the eyes have to change or the head shape has to change, right? So we're just slowly working our way through figuring out where exactly we want certain details, and then we can erase whatever we don't want later, but it's better to have sort of all of these little boundaries constantly, because it just gives us way more information to work with. So we're gonna move on to the nose. I feel like raccoons have pretty circular noses, surprisingly. Like they're a little bit boxy, but they're a lot more orbular than you think. And they take up a lot of the face too. So we're just going to slowly etch in the idea of a nose, and we're going to keep a little bit of square lines there, a little bit of angularity, and we're just going to color it in. So it gives us a better representation of how much nose we're talking here. And with that nose, we can sort of start laying in the bottom of that top lip. And then with that top lip, we can even add in the little tiny bottom jaw that raccoons have when they're looking right at you. So we have sort of the face of a raccoon built. We don't have a ton of detail set up yet, but we have all of the structure points we need to make this drawing realistic or make this drawing super detailed, right? So as we're going along, I know that I want some indication of this outer edge of the snout, and that's going to feed in a little bit into some cheeks, right into that bottom line of that top jaw, and then the same thing coming up through. And that jawline or that snout line really connects up super nicely to the dark patches on raccoons' faces. So we're just going to sort of let that line flow us to where we want it to be. Same thing on this side. We're just sort of letting that snout dictate where this line goes. We want it to be smooth. We want it to look accurate. And we can even start erasing some of these structure lines that didn't really make the cut, just to clean things up as we go along. And again, we can always add and you can always put those back as you're going, but we're just taking our time with this. And the more time you take, usually, the better the drawing turns out. So we're going to start laying in a little bit more of that shape for the nose. I'm adding a little bit of angularity at the bottom just because usually animals have a point at the bottom of their nose. So we're just going to etch a little bit of that in. We can even start thinking about nostrils just very slightly. Again, I'm not doing any sort of permanent lines yet. I'm just adding in small little details everywhere so that when I am ready to start doing some serious detail, I have all of those little bookmark points to work from, right? And already, like, all I'm doing is little details by little details, and that nose looks a hell of a lot better than what we started with, right? So, going back to the eyes, we have a little opportunity to start putting in some real detail. So I'm going to take a little bit of a leap of faith. Raccoons' eyes are a little bit like sideways raindrops. They have that beadiness to them, but they still have a little bit of that cat-like, dog-like wisp at the end. So we're going to add that in. And those look pretty good. Like, I'm pretty happy with those, so I think those are going to be permanent lines, but we're not going to make them permanent just yet. We made them darker, but we're not going to sort of focus on those being like the end all, right? And now that we have this face and everything looks proportionate, or at least I think it does for now, we're just going to darken up a couple of these lines and we're going to move on to figuring out how to make this head shape realistic, right? So raccoons, their snout goes in a little bit to their head. So we're just going to add some indication that it's moving in. And then they have these sort of big cheeks, right? And then their head is sort of like a trapezoid. So we're just going to slowly add in some boundary lines and just ideas of where we want this head to be. And then once you get to a point of getting these lines pretty solid, you can take a step back from the drawing. And this is a super important part of every drawing is every time you lay in sort of a big choice or a big idea, it's always smart to take a step back, like very physically, like move away from your drawing and really look at it and see like what looks off, because your eye is trained to see all of what's like realistic or to see what's off. So just trust yourself. So as I'm looking at this drawing, these cheeks look a little bit off. They look a little bit like they're not supposed to be there, right? So what I'm going to do is I'm going to cut them in just a little bit. Again, I'm not erasing any of those structure lines because everything is going to give me a little bit more information as we go. And then what I'm going to do is I'm going to extend the head just a little bit and give us a more accurate representation of what I want this raccoon to look like. And that looks a little bit better. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to erase those first little structure lines, and we're going to do the same thing of taking a step back and looking at this raccoon and seeing what we can fix. And from that, I think I can work with that a lot better than that previous pretty large cheek mistake, right? So what we're going to move on now is we're going to start blocking in spaces for the ears. Ears usually go straight up from the eyes, right? So that's one of our boundaries there. There's another boundary there. And then raccoons' ears are usually just pretty circular, kind of like a bear or a red panda. So we're just going to add in sort of a slight curved line there, trying to keep these fairly symmetrical. They don't need to be perfect yet because, again, we're just doing all of this very slow data or slow detail. And we're just going to, again, since we made a big choice, we're going to take a step back very physically and see, what ear looks off. Is the head shape still right when we add those ears in? Is there anything we can fix now? And so far what I'm thinking is no. I'm thinking it looks pretty solid. I actually think the little bandit eyes don't reach up that far past the eyeballs. So what I'm going to do before we start going into hard detail, I'm going to take away that line and we're going to cut that in just a little bit. This raccoon was starting to look like more of a panda than a raccoon, so I'm hoping by taking in these little bandit eyes, we're going to get to a more accurate representation. So these ears look pretty solid. There's really not a ton of detail to raccoon's ears, so we're just going to leave them for now. I'm pretty happy with the shape, nothing too crazy. And then we're just going to start refining all of these little ideas that we've been having this whole drawing. So we're going to go around the whole shape and just flush some things out and make sure that everything flows together nicely, everything feels pretty solid, nothing's out of the ordinary. And we can take another step back, obviously, and that looks pretty solid. So what I'm going to do now, before I start adding in, permanent lines and really dark, deep lines, I'm going to go in and I'm going to start focusing on some of the hair and some of the soft details that we can add. And the reason I'm doing that is because, especially with animals, it's really easy to hide certain mistakes with fur. It's also really nice to start with that fur and then you can add in dark lines on top of that fur, because if I start adding all of the dark lines, then I have to really etch in all of the fur lines and all of the texture and all of those things. But if we do it all sort of on a rolling basis, it's way easier to tweak, fine tune, and change as we go. So I'm just going to start adding in very short, choppy lines for dark fur. Again, like something to think about too, whenever you're drawing animals, is not a ton of wild animals have like long drapey fur or like fur that kind of mimics hair. It's a lot of buzz cuts everywhere. So when you're drawing or when you're editing or adding in value or shading or fur or whatever, like remember that all the fur is going to be short, because then all of your pencil strokes should be short too, right? Like um, we're mimicking the texture by actually mimicking all of the strokes. Like if you pretend that you're drawing every single piece of fur or every single hair sticking out, like you're not going to be drawing a full line and like really shading up and down this whole drawing. You're going to be drawing all of those little etchy furs, right? So we can sort of follow that, and we're just going to follow the shape of the head all throughout and add all those little scratchy hairs and those little buzz cut lines, um, and keeping it fairly light. Nothing's permanent yet. And once we get sort of this baseline value down, or texture, or whatever you want to call it, shading, then we can go in and we can start adding in, all of the points that make this look like it has depth, like all of the texture and shading in different direction for fur. But for now, we're just focusing on getting that sort of base layer, that first layer, down, so then we can play with it later. So I'm just keeping everything pretty light. I'm just adding in what I think is necessary, nothing crazy. Um, and this is when drawing animals gets fun for sure, because this is like sort of when you can zone out and zen out, because we've set up all of these boundaries, all of this structure, everything to set us up for success to the max, right? And now all we have to do is sort of color in, and we made it a paint by numbers, and it's like fun now, right? So even so, I'm going to add in all those dark scritchy lines for the little robber's mask. Same thing, there's not going to be any long fur anywhere, so I'm keeping all of my lines short, and that just gives whoever's looking at this piece, it makes it feel more real. It doesn't look, that uncanny valley, or it doesn't look different than what people are used to seeing, because the eye can pick out a lot of mistakes, and it can pick out a lot of things that don't look right, and then you zero in on those things. You never just sort of forget about certain mistakes. So the more we can do to make sure no one's looking at our drawing and seeing those mistakes, the better, right? So I'm pretty happy with all of this. We're going to add just like a little bit more detail as we're doing it, because it's fun. Nothing too crazy. And since we made a big choice by doing all of that shading and coloring, we have to take that step back, and we have to look and see, what looks off, what looks strange. And so far, nothing. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to take the next sort of big jump, and I'm going to color in these eyes. And again, like I was saying, raccoons have sort of beady rat eyes. So they're basically all black. They have just barely a little bit of white on the very far outside edge. But everything else is basically just a little black marble. So makes it pretty easy to color in, and not very stressful at all, because we're just coloring in a marble. So we'll put in a little bit of value there. And then, because everything feels pretty solid to me right now, I think it's time that we can start sort of adding in those permanent lines that we've been almost scared of this entire time. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to start adding in some pretty dark lines around the eye, and even giving him like a little bit of an eyelid or an eyelash. Raccoons also still have eyebrow bones, so there is a little bit of darker fur just above the eye, so we can add that in. And then we can start adding in the dark lines around its little mask. And this is just going to keep giving us more and more detail and more value to play with as we move through all of the other parts and all of the other details of this drawing. So we're just etching in. Again, still not super permanent. Like, all of this could still be erased if we really wanted to. We're getting to the point where that's not going to happen, but it's always smart to keep, you know, all of your options open, especially as you're adding in dark value and fur lines and all these things. We're going to darken up this nose. The bottom edge is always going to be darker than the top, so that's always smart to remember. Light does hit the nose much differently than everything else. And then we're going to darken up those nostrils that we drew in the beginning, because we're pretty comfortable with those. And then we're even going to sort of darken up the bottom edge of this nose as well, just to give it some more depth. And then we can darken up this bottom of the top lip. We can darken up the bottom of that bottom jaw and even give it a little bit of shading, because it is going to be cast in shadow. And then from there, it's basically just texture and figuring this out and making sure it looks solid. So we're just going to keep all these lines rough. The ears are super simple. They're just like puff balls, so we don't really need to add too much texture to those. The top of the head's usually pretty flat. Same thing on this side of the ear. They do have darker spots in the middle, just because that's sort of where the ear canal starts. So we're going to go in and add in just a little idea of that. So then when we do start coloring in the rest of this ear, we remember that that middle part has to be darker. And again, we're finally in the stage where we can sort of zen out and just color in all of these details that we've been painstakingly going over and double checking and cross checking and focusing on proportion. And now we're really just sort of getting to play with this raccoon buddy that we're drawing. So we're just going to blend that out a little bit, keeping these parts dark. Same thing on this ear, just keeping it a little bit darker than everything else. Adding a little bit of texture, nothing too crazy. And then we can go in and make these eyes a little bit more permanent. And by permanent, I just mean darker, making sure they look more and more realistic every pass that we take. And already he looks a lot more like he has personality now, which is fun. We can give some whiskers too. Just add them wherever. Maybe he has a little bit of goatee ones too. Just a little threep spot. And then, basically, remember all of that very easy detail and easy fur that we added to the top. We can go in and we can add some more serious lines and some dark and some texture, and just like really bring a bunch of this to life. So by keeping all these lines a little bit scratchy and a little bit etchy, we can add a lot of detail and a lot of texture to this little raccoon's face, which is really fun. And that always gives the viewers more to look at. It gives us more points of reference to keep drawing and keep adding serious detail. And it's very possible and very easy to do it this way, because we laid in that sort of small first layer of detail as well. So now it's really just sort of making this raccoon look fun and scraggly. You can move your hatches around usually when you get to the top of the head to add a little bit of extra texture. But really, we're just in that sort of finishing phase of this drawing. which is sweet. And there we go. A pretty solid raccoon. Started from nothing. So again, just sort of going over all of those little lessons that we talked about. 1 second, we're gonna add in a little bit of shadow around his snout just to make him look more realistic. But like that's a solid raccoon drawing, right? And all we did was start with that big oval. We added in that sort of prism snout to give us those boundaries, and then we slowly added in all of the detail that we needed. But with that, I actually have to run. So, Magnus, I don't know if you're still here, but I can't get to the cell shading again. I set up the face drawing as a warm-up and that raccoon as the finisher, and it spent all my time. You're still here? Damn! Okay, well, let me do, when I'm live, I think I'll be live tomorrow, hopefully, and I'll do like a full deep dive in shading and cell shading then, which will be sick, and then we can talk about it and have a discussion, but I just really wanted to draw a raccoon tonight. Might add if I didn't respond to something else because I'm playing a game with my cousin. Oh, no worries, dude. Thanks for hanging around. Thanks for listening to me. Sounds awesome. Oh, thank you. That's so badass. I'm glad that I'm helping. Like that's the whole point of all this is to just be helpful and to teach a little bit. But yeah, with that, I'm out of here. I've been Nathan. Thank you everyone that's watching. Thanks for TikTok. See ya. Nice. All right. Hey, you too, Magnus. Thanks for hanging. Means a lot to me.